Partnership. I'm really excited to have you today. We mentioned ChatGPT a little bit earlier, and clearly AI is talk of the town. And one of the things that pop up around AI is areas of accountability and trust and algorithms and things of that nature. There's also a strong push to maybe regulate it going forward. And when I heard that, Dileep, you recently issued a report on this very topic, I asked you to join and share a few minutes about some of the lessons learned about AI accountability and conformity. So with that, sir, handing over the microphone over to you.
Thanks so much, Jay, and thanks everyone for joining today. As Jay mentioned, my name is Dileep Srihari. I'm with Access Partnership, a global tech policy consulting firm. I'm actually based in our Washington, D.C. office, but I do have colleagues in India and around the world. So I don't have slides, although is Gaurav still, is someone sharing their screen? I'm sorry. Okay, I'll just proceed. So I don't have slides, but the way I'm going to sort of outline this talk is sort of in three parts. First, I'll just sort of give a little bit of an overview of what's happening in the US. Second, I'll talk a little bit about what's going on with AI policy in India. And then last, I'll talk about the paper that we recently released at Access Partnership. So first, on the USA side, what's happening out there in the world right now? So last year, I would say a lot of interest in AI policy in Congress and in the states, motivated by concerns about algorithmic bias, among other things. For example, in the employment context, with AI systems potentially being used to read resumes, or AI in criminal sentencing, or AI in facial recognition, and how the algorithms being trained having discriminatory effects and impacts. This year, I think the conversation has changed pretty quickly with the explosion of generative AI technologies into the global zeitgeist with ChatGPT and its peers being out there. There's a lot of conversation in Washington, D.C. and around the country about these issues and what the proper regulatory frameworks should be. I think it's still very early and it's still nascent. That there's going to be a lot of policymaker interest on this. So what's been happening in terms of regulation in the US? We have seen a few bills in Congress, especially in the last Congress, on AI regulation. Most notably, the leading privacy bill in Congress that was approved pretty overwhelmingly in a House committee, but ultimately didn't make it through Congress, had some AI provisions in it. Which I'll talk about in a little bit. Meanwhile, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, recently released its AI framework, trying to build on the success of the NIST cybersecurity framework, which was sort of seen as initially as a voluntary approach for industry self-regulation. So that was recently released. Meanwhile, even as Congress hasn't acted yet, there's definitely been some action at the state level on AI policy in the United States. Most notably, New York City passed a law that requires third-party auditing of AI systems, which has been quite controversial and gotten a lot of interest in the United States. Some other state legislatures in the US have been moving forward on AI accountability mechanisms as well. Meanwhile, over in India, so in 2020, Prime Minister Modi said, we want India to become the global hub for AI. We see many startups and unicorns in the space in India that are doing great work in the AI space. And some of them are very India-specific contexts, such as using AI for affordable breast cancer screening at clinics in rural India, or using AI for small future-ready farming solutions for the agricultural sector in India. So undoubtedly, there's a business interest in India from the Prime Minister on down in supporting AI technology in India. India released a national strategy on AI in 2018. More recently, Niti Aayog, the government think tank, released a set of responsible AI principles in 2021. And the first sort of use case that Niti Aayog identified to implement those responsible AI principles was facial recognition, and they released a paper on that specific topic just recently in November 2022. And then beyond Niti Aayog and the Prime Minister, MIRI, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, they've also constituted several committees to begin developing a policy framework for what AI policy and regulation should look like in India. And I also wanted to mention that with India leading the G20 this year, India will also be leading the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, which is a G20 initiative. And there was a G20 ministerial statement on AI principles that was actually released just last November as well. So with that background, I wanted to talk a little bit about the paper that we recently released. And what our paper does is it talks about 3 different methods for algorithmic accountability for AI technologies. And the 3 methods are impact assessments, third-party auditing, and then the conformity assessments approach that the European Union is actually taking in its AI Act. So beginning with impact assessments, and let me tell you that this is sort of the approach that our paper favors. Impact assessments are familiar to a lot of companies from the privacy context. There are often government regulations, such as, or regulators, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the US, for example, will sometimes require companies to undertake a privacy impact assessment as part of the settlement agreements that it brings. The GDPR privacy regulation in Europe also requires data protection impact assessments. And so what our paper does is it describes algorithmic impact assessments, and we give some examples of the types of questions that companies ask themselves internally as they're developing these processes to support AI accountability to make sure that their products do not have discriminatory effects. So what we found is that a lot of policymakers don't necessarily understand what impact assessments are. So our paper tries to demystify that somewhat. Second, we talk about third-party auditing in the paper, but mainly here we're illustrating that policymakers are a little bit ahead of where the technology and where the standards are in this context. Because right now we don't really have we don't have mature standards against which to audit particular algorithms. So that creates problems. There are some companies out there that are doing AI audits, but the quality of those audits varies wildly. The results are not readily translatable across domains. Even the qualifications of what it means to be an AI auditor are still being defined. So it's very much unlike auditing in the financial statements context where you have generally accepted accounting principles, for example. We just aren't there yet with third-party standards. So our paper highlights some of the problems with that approach to AI algorithmic accountability, at least for now. And then third, we talk in the paper about the EU AI Act, which takes the approach of conformity assessments. So the EU approach, that conformity assessment model is actually borrowed from consumer product safety regulations. So those regulations are the safety of physical goods, physical, devices that are sold out into the marketplace. So they're trying to adapt that regulation to the software domain, which creates its own set of questions and issues that we raise in the paper as well. One good thing about the EU AI Act is that it does sort of focus on high-risk systems a little bit more than some of the approaches that we've seen in other contexts. So our paper includes, a series of recommendations as well, urging policymakers to move in the direction of algorithmic impact assessments, supporting harmonization across the world, supporting the standards work. And we do say, sort of following the background of what happened in privacy, that it's okay for policymakers to think about adopting a regulatory backstop to require companies to do an impact assessment in some cases, as opposed to requiring a third-party audit. So that's sort of the thrust of our paper. And we're some of the companies that we're talking to are using this, particularly in the US, to talk to various state governments that are considering audit laws. But I think there's probably also some room for doing some education education with policymakers in India on this as well. So I'll stop there, Jay, but would be happy to field any questions, and would be happy to follow up with any companies separately as well.
Thanks. Nabil, your camera's on as you're walking around. If you could turn that off. Thank you, sir. So my question, you mentioned GPay, right? India is the president of GPay, and we haven't really heard what they're planning on doing. Do you have any insight or any thoughts on how that might evolve?
Not a huge amount. I mean, the principles that they released last November were pretty high level. The ministerial declaration was sort of, the 13 sentences, essentially.
Right.
So I think it's sort of an open greenfield for where India is going to take that this year. But I think the importance of GPay is probably a lot higher on the agenda than it was a year ago because of everything that's been exploding into the news.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Also, USIBC, we're looking at an AI panel at our Idea Summit that looks at some of the generative AI issues across the board, from technology and disruptions and whatnot. Any questions from our members about this report? I posted it in the chat box. Any questions? Raise your hand. All right, Dileep, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I invite our members to give us some comments and feedback on these types of briefings. If there are topics you want us to bring forward, or if you have issued a report or other new product or whatnot that we want to showcase, we're more than happy to bring you on board. With that, I'm